my name is Tom Schiff. I'm the director of Fallacies Incorporated. Fallacies is an organization that uses dialogue and theater to engage men and boys in critical conversations and direct action to challenge unhealthy aspects of masculinity, or traditional masculinity, I should say. And you can read more about that with my bio and so forth. But I want to talk to you all about a term that's become pretty popular, so to speak, these days, toxic masculinity, and also what we can do with it. So, toxic masculinity, what is that exactly? To me, it's really two things. It's a term that's both helpful and not helpful. It's helpful in that it allows us to think about what are some unhealthy ways in which men and boys act, and the way men and boys think, and it's not healthy because, or not helpful, I should say, in that it puts people into a box of good or bad. There's masculinity that is healthy and masculinity that's not healthy. And I don't believe any of that. I believe it's actually much more of a continuum. And nobody is 100% toxic and nobody's 100% non-toxic. But it is important to think about what it is and how it plays out. So toxic masculinity really is a form or a way of thinking about how we are as men and boys. That means we're supposed to be tough, in control, sexually aggressive. Nothing that's feminine is considered okay. It's often anti-woman. And there's a lot of violence that's part of this, as well as behaviors that aren't really seen as, they're not seen as, they're just not healthy. Things like alcohol and drug use, or refusing to wear everything from seatbelts to condoms, or a host of other health issues. Men and boys have much worse health outcomes than women, girls, and in many cases trans folks as well, but that's not 100% true. For example, male-identified folks represent about 80% of all the folks who commit suicide in this country. And while other people, women, attempt it more, and the numbers for trans folks is through the roof, it's still a significant concern in regard to thinking about this. Some of this has to do, from my perspective, is the ways that men are, and boys, really how boys are told, this is how you act, this is how you become a man, this is what it means to be a man. You're supposed to be, as I said, tough, in control, all those sorts of things, those messages. You should be a ladies' man and a man's man, whatever that means. And some of that then relates to also issues around how we are in relationships in regard to being violent, aggressive, abusive, so forth. And those sorts of things are part of what we really want to think about, how we challenge some of that, as well as how do we challenge the unhealthy ways that we are just individually to ourselves. And that's really a place that I want to focus in about a minute or two. But I also want to say that young people today are seeing this. They're having these conversations. They're very aware that traditional notions of masculinity are creating sexually aggressive and unhealthy attitudes and behaviors, more homophobic behaviors, more violence in general, and also that young men and older men, for that matter, who buy into these ways of being are much less likely to be able to express emotions in a healthy way. So all that said, what are some things we do with that? Well, one, we have to keep in mind that men is not a monolithic category, right? We have to think about lots of different ways that men are. There's race, class, sexuality, culture, religion, ability, a bunch of different social identities that play into not only how we think of ourselves as men, but also the way people perceive us as men and boys, and how we then enact those behaviors, how society allows us to be. That's one. So that means also that there's a collective responsibility that we have to think about how we raise our children and how we raise our boys. So let me give you a couple thoughts I have about things that I think that are useful for this. So one is modeling vulnerability, modeling emotionality, modeling nurturance. It's okay for men to cry. It's okay for men to hug each other. It's okay for men to be vulnerable, like really vulnerable, to take chances in our relationships, whether it's friendships or intimate relationships. To really value, it's a fascinating thing to watch a young boy who can be so close to his friends, and he gets to middle school, and all of a sudden there's that wall that comes up. And how do we help them continue to not have the wall up? How do we get them to continue to be close, be vulnerable? Because those are such incredible relationships. I remember those for myself. The relationships I had with other young men were just incredible. And there's a certain point where we're told we're not supposed to do that anymore. How do we get folks to care about themselves? How do we get to want to do the things that they need to do that are good for themselves as well as others? We want to teach healthy relationship skills. So, and all of this is stuff we want to start early on. Talking about consent, well, what does that mean for all of us when we're 5 and 6? We're not talking about sexual consent. We're talking about body literacy and how do we think about our bodies and other bodies and even just our interactions with folks. How do we get folks to talk about decision making in relationships that's mutual? So it's not just about what I want, but what does my partner want? How do we do this together? Or the person I'm dating, or the person I'm talking to, whatever that is. How do we have those kind of relationships? How do we talk about how relationships have ebb and flows? And so we're not going to get everything that we want, and it's not always going to be great. So those are part of thinking about healthy relationships that we want our young men to be able to think about. And again, I'll say this again, self-care. Self-care is critical because so many men don't take care of themselves. I think a critical skill for working with boys of all ages is bystander intervention. And there's a lot of curriculum that are out there around anti-bullying kinds of stuff. And I think that's critical to think about that, but also to think about having some kind of gendered perspectives in that. And for boys, I think that one of the things that we need to keep in mind is that most boys, and there's lots of research that backs this up, most boys are actually uncomfortable when they hear other boys, and men are the same way, when they hear other boys putting down girls, when they hear boys making homophobic statements, racist statements. All these kinds of behaviors are things that most boys actually have a hard time with, but they think that they're the only ones, and so they stay quiet. So one of the things that we have to do is really get our boys thinking about, so no, you actually aren't alone in this, and how do we get you to think about using some of what is perhaps part of a more traditional way of being, like you're supposed to be courageous, you're supposed to be bold. Well, be courageous and bold and call people out or call people in, whichever skill feels more pertinent at the time. Also, one of the things that I have to say is that the collective socialization of boys, the collective socialization of people, but we're here talking about boys right now, is really pretty traumatic. There's ways in which if we don't fit into certain molds, we are ostracized. There's violence against us. There's name calling. There's a whole slew of behaviors that are there to try to put us into a particular box, a particular way of being. And so part of the work that we want to do is thinking about how do we deal with that trauma? How do we stop it before it happens if we can? But if it has happened, how do we help heal that? And some of that's about us modeling empathy and about us listening and engaging and nurturing and those sorts of things, and understanding that that's going to come up in different ways for folks, and that we want to be able to think about that. If you're an educator, I also would ask you to think about what are the things that you're teaching. How can we teach history in ways that's not just about, and I know a lot of you are doing great work out there, that's not only teaching things around aggression and war, and how are we teaching about the contributions of all peoples. How are we, what are we reading in our English and literature classes? Who are the writers that we're reading? There's tons of literature out there for young people that's starting to be much more both multicultural, but also different views around gender. when we're talking about science, are we talking about the contributions of folks from around the world? Are we making sure that we talk about women's contributions? Because all these things actually have an impact on how young men grow up in the world, and how boys begin to really think about themselves as equitable members of society. If you're a coach, you have an incredible opportunity. And there's lots of different curricula out there. One in particular I would mention is called Coaching Boys to Men, and it's very short, like 11 different pieces, but you can do them in like 15 minutes. So you can do it during practice. And if you're a coach, I encourage you to think about ways that you can use your impact and your influence to help raise these boys. So it's not just about going out and winning, but it's about becoming good, growing into becoming good, positive, healthy men. And I think I'm going to stop there and just say that, again, this is a collective process. So one of the things that we really need to do is have dialogue with each other and reach out to each other. We can't do this by ourselves. We have to know our limits. There's going to be places where you're going to want to talk to an expert. You want to talk to a fellow teacher or parent or counselor or whoever. This is one of the things that's really critical. And also, if we can model that we're doing that, we're also modeling to our boys that we're reaching out to people as well, because that's part of the traditional toxic way of doing things is, I got to do this by myself. I would love to talk with any of you about this more. Thank you very much for your time.